It was early evening. The sunset was like a crimson scarf over the edge of the harbor, and a low mist hung in the water. The tugboats were returning to the great ocean dock after a long day's work. Hank and Theodore floated up to each other until they were almost bumper to bumper, face to face. Then they whistled and said, "Hello." Well, that's the way tugboats say hello. Then they all gathered around the dock. Now came Theodore's favorite time of all, the time when the tugs all told stories about their day.
"What did you do today, Emily?"
asked Theodore.
"George Fodak and I moved a cargo ship,"
replied Emily.
"His name was Beiderbecke, and he was from Germany. He had a big load of..."
"A big load of..."
said Hank.
"Do you mean apples?" said Theodore helpfully. It was then that Theodore and Hank realized that the other tugs were all staring at something. "Wow," said Theodore. "Yow," said Hank. There, appearing out of the mist, was the strangest looking ship the tugs had ever seen. He was all made of wood and had a big flat sail with an odd pattern on it. He had a long, wolfy head with big, beamy eyes and powerful-looking jaws. Who is it?" said Emily. "I've never seen anything like him before," said Fodak. "Do you think he's dangerous?" said George, and he rumbled his engine bravely, but not too loud.
"He's coming this way," said Hank.
"Someone should go and say hello," said Theodore. The other tugs all turned to Theodore. Theodore put on his friendliest face and floated right up to the strange-looking ship until he was almost touching its wolfy snout with his bumper. Then he let out a loud, welcoming whistle and said, "Hello," the way tugboats always said hello. Well, the most surprising thing of all happened after that. The strange-looking ship backed up a little and snorted right at Theodore. Well, Theodore was so startled he turned and hurried back to the dock. Now, that wasn't what he had expected at all. That night, the tugboats couldn't stop talking about the strange-looking new ship. "He snorted at me," said Theodore. "The question is," said Fodak, "who is he?"
"Where did he come from?" said Emily.
"What's he doing in our harbor?" grumbled George.
"He looks like a wolf," said Hank.
Suddenly, the tugs went silent. The strange-looking ship was floating quietly past them. He was heading for the dock right next to the tugs, and it looked as if he meant to stay there. The tugboats all huddled together, just a little closer. No one told stories that night as they usually did. Instead, they all worried and watched the strange ship. The next morning, Theodore and Emily were heading off to work when they saw the strange ship again.
"He's just floating up and down the harbor,"
whispered Emily. Just then, Hank came pooting merrily along, pulling a barge. The strange ship silently came up behind him.
"What's he doing?"
said Theodore in a hushed voice.
"It looks,"
replied Emily,
"that he's trying to sneak up behind Hank."
Suddenly, Hank saw the strange ship. Hank turned quickly so that he was face to face with the ship. Then he whistled and said, "Hello." Well, the ship backed up and snorted right at Hank, just the way he'd snorted at Theodore when Theodore had tried to say hello. "Yikes," gasped Hank, and he floated away with the barge as fast as he could. He had been so frightened by the strange snorting ship, his engine was pounding.
"Come on, Theodore,"
Emily called softly.
"Let's take the long way back to the dock before the strange ship sees us."
But Theodore couldn't stop thinking about the strange-looking ship. Why did he try and sneak up behind Hank like that, he wondered? And why is he snorting at everybody? That day, all the tugboats went far out of their way to avoid the strange-looking ship. Because of that, everything in the harbor was taking longer than usual. When the tugboats finally returned to their dock, the dispatcher had stern words for them. "Tugboats," he said in his most serious voice, "ships have been complaining about how long it's taking to get to their docks. Can someone please tell me what is going on?" "It's that strange-looking ship," said George.
"Yes," said Emily. "He just floats up and down the harbor all day long."
"He snorts at tugs," said Photok.
"He snuck up behind me," added Hank, and he has big teeth."
Well, the dispatcher had to admit that even he had never seen a ship like that before, and he certainly was acting very strangely. "Nevertheless," the dispatcher went on, "I don't expect him to slow down the work of this harbor. That is all."
"That ship is very different," said Emily quietly.
Once more, the strange-looking ship stayed in the dock beside the tugs. Now, having the ship right next to them made the tugs all very worried, and they didn't tell their usual stories again that night. "I have to do something," thought Theodore to himself. Just before the sun went down, Theodore decided to visit a special friend. Theodore hoped Rebecca, the research vessel, could tell him about the strange-looking ship. See, Theodore thought Rebecca knew just about everything there was to know about ships. "He looks like a Viking ship," said Rebecca.
"A Viking ship?"
repeated Theodore.
"What's that?"
"Well, Viking ships sailed the oceans over 1,000 years ago," replied Rebecca. "They were great explorers. This ship in our harbor may be a brand new Viking ship." "But," said Theodore,
"what is he doing here?"
"I really don't know," said Rebecca.
"Well, I don't think he likes us."
"If he is a Viking ship," said Rebecca,
"maybe he just doesn't speak our language."
"Did you try to say hello to him?"
"Yes, I did,"
replied Theodore. And then he thought back to the first time he had seen the strange ship and how he had tried to say hello. "I wonder," said Theodore to himself. Emily was waiting when Theodore returned to the dock.
"Theodore,"
she said,
"nothing is the way it should be around here since that strange ship arrived, and no one is getting any work done."
"And no one tells stories at the dock anymore," added Theodore sadly.
"We have to do something," said Emily firmly. "We have to speak to that ship right now."
And without another word, Emily set off toward the strange-looking ship. Theodore followed behind. Emily floated up, face to face to the strange ship, whistled, and said,
"Hello."
Well, the ship backed up a little and snorted at her.
"Let's go, Theodore,"
Emily said to Theodore with a frown.
"He's just a mean ship."
But Theodore turned towards the strange ship. He didn't really look mean, and when Theodore thought about it, the ship looked kind of sad.
"Theodore,"
said Emily,
"what are you doing?"
"I'm going to say hello," said Theodore. And this time, Theodore didn't float right up face to face with the strange ship to say hello, like tugs usually did. Instead, he slowly floated up behind the ship, just the way he had seen the ship float up behind Hank. And this time, the ship didn't snort. What it did was even more surprising than that. "Hello," said the stranger. "My name is Snorri, and I'm a Viking ship. I'm very pleased to meet you."
"Hello, Snorri,"
replied Theodore.
"I'm Theodore. I'm a tugboat, and I'm very pleased to meet you."
Well, after Emily had gotten over her surprise, she floated over to Snorri and said,
"Why are you being so mean and snorting at everyone?"
"I thought you were being mean to me," replied Snorri.
"I think," explained Theodore to Emily, "it's just that Snorri has a different way of saying hello than we do. See, we tugboats always say hello by floating right up to each other face to face and whistling," said Theodore.
"I didn't know that," said Snorri, quite surprised. "We Viking ships always float up behind each other to say hello. We think that when you come right up to us face to face like that, you're going to bump us. That's why I snorted at you."
"You didn't know I just wanted to say hello?"
said Emily. She just had to smile.
"And all this time, we thought you didn't like us."
I thought you didn't like me, said Snorri. I've been floating up and down the harbor trying to talk to someone, but everyone keeps floating away.
Talk about what? Said Theodore.
I'm visiting harbors everywhere to tell stories about what it was like for us Viking ships to explore the ocean 1,000 years ago, explained Snorri. This harbor is my first stop.
And then he looked sad.
But I haven't been able to tell a single story to anyone yet.
Well, Theodore and Emily looked at each other. Were they thinking the same thing? The other tugboats were at the great ocean dock. Theodore was the first to see them. There was Emily and Theodore, and floating right in the middle, between them, was the strange ship.
Hello,
said the ship.
My name is Snorri, and I'm a Viking ship.
Well, the other tugs were so surprised, they didn't say anything for a moment. Hank began to float bravely forward to say hello, but Theodore went over and whispered, "Go up behind him, Hank. That's how Viking ships say hello." Hank turned and came up behind Snorri, just like Theodore had told him to do. "Hello," he began nervously. My name is Tugboat, and I'm a Hank. Said Hank, my name is Hank, and I'm a tugboat. Well, everybody began to laugh, and their nervousness disappeared as if it had never really been there at all. That night, the tugboats all listened to Snorri, the Viking ship, tell many wonderful stories of faraway places and long ago times. And everyone agreed it was the best storytelling time they could ever remember. Theodore was giving everyone a shower with his fire hose. You see, today the tugs all wanted to look extra shipshape. Today, Canso Colossus, the king of all supertankers, was coming to visit the big harbor. "Spray me too, Theodore," shouted Hank. "Spray me."
Here it comes.
Whee, giggled Hank. "It tickles." "What a wonderful day," smiled Emily. "And we haven't even done anything yet."
That's a rotten day,
a grumpy voice said. It was Guysborough, the garbage barge. Theodore was pulling him along, collecting garbage from here and there in the harbor.
and I've done plenty already,
continued Guysborough.
Most of it extremely stinky and steamy.
You see, Guysborough is a very grumpy garbage barge. Just then, the tugs heard a deep, powerful horn. Canso Colossus was entering the harbor.
Theodore, frowned George, you better finish moving Guysborough later so you can help bring our special guest in.
Theodore quickly took Guysborough back to his dock. "Now you stay right there while we bring in Canso Colossus," said Theodore.
I'm a garbage barge,
Griped Guysborough.
Can't move by myself anyway. Not that I want to. Nowhere worth going in the first place.
Guysborough is very grumpy today, Theodore thought to himself. But he quickly forgot about his friend. He really wanted to meet Canso Colossus. The tugs had just started to bring in Canso Colossus, king of all the supertankers. George was leading the great ship on a tour.
There's the oil refinery.
He boomed in his biggest voice.
It's really huge.
"That's Willie's Island," said Emily, "where Lily the Lighthouse lives."
Over there's the repair dock, said Theodore. A very safe place.
Each tug wanted to show Canso their favorite thing about the harbor. "That's Fundy the fishing boat," called Hank. "Hank," whispered George, "we're only showing Canso important things." The tugs all wanted to hear what Canso Colossus, king of all the supertankers, liked best about the big harbor. But Canso still hadn't said anything.
Theodore hurried along to the back of the supertanker to help Hank push. Canso really doesn't say much, Hank whispered to Theodore.
This is the cleanest harbor I've ever seen,
Said Canso suddenly. The tugs were all a bit surprised, because Canso had a kind of a squeaky voice for a king.
Well, said George slowly. Yes, I guess it is sort of clean.
It's very important to have a clean harbor.
Canso went on in his kind of squeaky voice.
I don't like it when there's lots of yucky stuff floating around.
Oh, there's never any yucky stuff in our harbor, said Foduck. It's a very clean harbor, Theodore called from the back. The cleanest harbor anywhere, added Emily. It's fresh, shouted Hank. Fresh was the only thing he could think of, and besides, it was such a terrific sounding word.
I guess we're just lucky,
concluded George. Now, at that very moment, they were passing the junk dock and Guysborough.
Just lucky?
Grumbled Guysborough. He had heard what George said.
Well, who do they think keeps this harbor clean anyway? Not the tugboats.
Nope, said Jasper, the junk dock. Of course, nope is all Jasper ever says.
If it wasn't for me,
Griped Guysborough.
this harbor'd be full of stinky, steamy old garbage, and don't think it wouldn't.
Nope, said Jasper.
Just what I thought.
Concluded Guysborough.
Well, from now on, I won't pick up any more garbage. We'll just see how clean things are around here. Not very.
Nope, said Jasper.
I thought so, too.
Said Guysborough. The following morning, bright and early, Theodore went to get Guysborough to collect garbage around the harbor as usual.
I'm not working today.
Snapped Guysborough as soon as he saw Theodore coming towards him. Well, Theodore tried hard not to smile, but a little grin peeped through anyway. Now I can go visit Canso Colossus, Theodore thought to himself. Great, he shouted out loud.
Great.
Asked Guysborough. Have a great day, Guysborough.
See?
Said Guysborough.
No one cares about me.
Nope, said Jasper.
I thought so, too.
Theodore happily puffed towards Canso. I don't have any work today, he called to the king of all supertankers, so I can visit you.
Well, that's Jim Dandy,
replied Canso Colossus in his kind of squeaky voice.
We can float right here together and enjoy this nice, clean harbor.
Well, to Theodore, that sounded like a wonderful kingly idea, enjoying the harbor.
Hey, what's that?
Said Canso suddenly, sounding very worried. To his surprise, Theodore saw something stinky and steamy floating right there in the water. Stammered Theodore nervously.
Yucky stuff.
Concluded Canso.
I don't like yucky stuff. It sticks to my hull. Not good.
Yes, well, no, said Theodore. He really didn't know what else to say. He had never noticed any garbage in the water before. The big harbor is usually very clean, he said.
Oh, well, this is terrible. Terrible.
Groaned Canso.
It's not right for a king to float in the middle of a mess. Theodore, I want to leave the harbor. Please go and get the other tugboats and take me out at once.
Oh, no, gasped Theodore. But he had to agree. Things really did seem, well, kind of yucky.
I suppose you tugboats better get going then,
said the dispatcher, after Theodore had told him the bad news.
If Canso wants to leave our harbor, there's nothing we can do to stop him.
But why does he want to leave? Asked Emily. Canso says the big harbor is a big mess, explained Theodore.
There does seem to be a lot of garbage around here lately,
said the dispatcher. The other tugs sadly headed off to get Canso. Why is our harbor so yucky all of a sudden? Theodore wondered out loud.
When you float in the harbor, remember the ocean,
A familiar voice said. It was Fundy, the fishing trawler. Now, Fundy always says strange things. When you float in the harbor, remember the ocean, Theodore repeated to himself, trying to understand what Fundy meant. Well, the harbor is usually full of water, thanks to the ocean that fills it up. And the water is usually clean, thanks to Guysborough. Suddenly, Theodore knew there was a way to stop Canso Colossus from leaving the harbor, and to get rid of the stinky, steamy mess, too. And it was up to him. Guysborough, shouted Theodore. Why won't you pick up garbage anymore?
I just won't.
Replied Guysborough grumpily. Nope, added Jasper the junk doc. Of course, nope is all Jasper ever says. Just then, they heard Canso's deep whistle. Theodore could see the other tugs beginning to take the great supertanker out of the harbor. But Guysborough, Theodore went on, we need you.
Well, no one needed me before.
Grumbled Guysborough. Nope, added Jasper.
Just what I thought.
Said Guysborough. Theodore suddenly smiled. You stay right there, Guysborough, he called, and raced off towards the other tugs.
I'm a garbage barge.
Griped Guysborough.
Can't move by myself anyway. Not that I want to. Nowhere worth going in the first place.
Nope, added Jasper.
I thought so too.
Said Guysborough. A little while later, Guysborough was just settling in for a nice, long, grumpy mood when he saw an incredible sight. All the tugs were leading a giant supertanker straight towards him. Hello, Guysborough, whistled the tugs.
Hello.
Replied Guysborough in a surprised but still grumpy voice. The tugs gathered round Guysborough. Guysborough couldn't figure out what everyone was doing there. No one ever visited him.
Are you the garbage barge who used to keep this harbor so nice and clean?
The giant supertanker said.
Well, yes, I guess I was.
Replied Guysborough. He kept the harbor very clean, said Theodore.
Cleanest harbor in the whole world,
roared George proudly. And fresh, added Hank. Fresh was still the only word Hank could think of, and it always sounded so terrific.
Well, I'm certainly glad to meet you, Guysborough,
continued Canso.
and I certainly hope you can get rid of all this yucky stuff soon. It was much nicer here before.
Well, I thought no one noticed.
Guysborough said in an unusually soft voice.
I guess we really didn't,
admitted George. But we're really glad you always collect the garbage, said Emily. And we guess we never really told you before, added Theodore. Now, you couldn't actually tell, but Guysborough almost kind of smiled. Oh, it was a very small, rotten little smile, but it was a smile.
Well, what are you just floating there for, Theodore?
Said Guysborough.
We've got garbage to collect.
Well, he didn't have to ask Theodore twice. With a cheerful toot-toot of his whistle, he was off with Guysborough to collect the garbage again. Everyone blew their whistles to say, "Thanks, Guysborough. Good work."
Well,
grumbled Guysborough.
I couldn't do it without Jasper.
Nope, said Jasper.
Just what I thought,
said Guysborough. One fine morning, Hank was setting off to work. "Hello, Hank," tooted Constance. "Hello, Hank," called Blue Nose, the sailing ship. "Hi, Hank," called Rebecca, the research vessel. It seemed like everyone in the whole harbor wanted to say hello to Hank. "This is the friendliest harbor in the whole world," Hank shouted out loud. "Morning, Hank," called Benjamin. Hank felt so happy, he whistled a little tune to everyone. Now, Hank's job that day was to move Bayswater barge. "Hello, Bumper Bum," shouted Bayswater.
Well, Hank was so surprised that for a moment he thought Bayswater might have been talking to someone else. He didn't see anyone else.
Hello, Bumper Bum,
repeated Bayswater, even louder this time. There was no doubt about it. Bayswater was talking to him. It was funny, but that name hurt. It was like someone had bumped him hard. Bayswater just laughed.
Funny name, huh?
He said. Uh-huh, Hank said slowly, but he still wasn't really sure why Bayswater had called him that. He wasn't sure he liked it. A little later, Hank arrived at the oil refinery with Bayswater. There was a big pile of oil drums in the dock, waiting for Bayswater to pick up.
Let's load my oil drums, Bumper Bum.
Bayswater giggled. Well, by this time, Hank just had to say something.
Ready when you are, Barge Bum.
Bayswater began to laugh and laugh. Hank began to laugh too.
Barge Bum.
He shouted again, and both of them were laughing now. Hank had to admit to himself that it was kind of fun to make up silly names like that.
Hurry up, Bathwater.
He hooted. Hank began laughing so hard, his whistle made a funny sound.
Ha ha ha,
roared Bayswater.
You sound like a big goose. Honk. Bird bath.
Hank shouted right back. The two of them laughed and laughed until their whistles hurt. Well, at the end of the day, after they had finished working, Hank dropped Bayswater off at his dock and began to float home. Then he stopped and turned back to Bayswater again.
See you later, Barge Bum,
he shouted. Hank! Hank was surprised to see Pearl, the pilot boat. I heard what you called Bayswater, said Pearl. It's not very nice to say things like that. Pilot pooper, Hank said under his breath. Then he grinned a little grin. Somehow, having Pearl tell him it wasn't nice made saying things like that seem even funnier. Early the next day, the dispatcher sent Theodore and Hank to bring in a cargo ship. Hank could see the cargo ship, whose name was Inverness, waiting for them near the harbor entrance. Now, Inverness had a very pointy bow. Hank's mind began to race, just like his engine. He hurried on ahead of Theodore and pulled up right in front of Inverness.
Hello, Needle Nose,
he shouted with a great big grin. Inverness didn't say anything. Then Hank puffed along to the back of the ship to help push, tooting his whistle with laughter. What a funny name I thought of, he smiled to himself. But when Theodore arrived at the ship, something very peculiar happened. Inverness began to lower his anchor, as if he meant to stay right there. What are you doing? Asked Theodore. Inverness just floated there, silent and still. Well, don't you want to come into the harbor? Theodore went on. No, I don't, Inverness replied in a very cross-sounding voice. Well, why not? Theodore asked. As if to answer him, Inverness began to turn away from Hank. Theodore floated along to the back of Inverness to talk to Hank. Hank, he said, this ship doesn't want to come into the harbor. He doesn't? Said Hank. Why not? I have no idea, Theodore said. He doesn't want to come into the harbor, the dispatcher said when Theodore had told him what had happened. But why not? We don't know, replied Theodore. Do we, Hank?
No. Can you think of any reason? Continued the dispatcher. No, said Theodore. No, said Hank. Just then, they heard an emergency whistle. And Foduck, the safety tug, came racing up to the dock, all out of breath. That ship who was supposed to come into the harbor is leaving, he puffed. Leaving? Asked the dispatcher. Sure enough, Inverness was on his way out of the harbor. Well, why wouldn't he want to come into our harbor? The dispatcher thought out loud. This is the friendliest harbor anywhere. And then he gazed out towards Inverness as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Theodore, he said. Yes, sir. I want you to try to bring him back to the harbor. Please proceed immediately. Theodore didn't waste a beat of his engine. He set off right away after Inverness, with Hank following along. Now they could see that Inverness was already quite a ways out on the ocean. I wonder where Needlenose is going, said Hank. What did you call him? Theodore said, turning to Hank. I said, where's he going? Repeated Hank. You called him Needlenose, said Theodore. I did, said Hank. Hank had said it without even thinking. I made it up myself. It's funny. Well, frowned Theodore, you'd better not call Inverness that or we'll never get him to come back into our harbor. Well, why not, Theodore? Hank wanted to know. Because, answered Theodore, it's not nice. Just then, Hank had a horrible feeling. Theodore, he called softly. What is it, Hank? I really have to go. I think I did. I think I did call him that. You what? Said Theodore, glaring at Hank. Hank, oh, sometimes you're such a bumperhead. Theodore was so cross with Hank, he just blurted out the first thing he could think of to say. And that name hurt Hank like someone had bumped him hard. And the next thing Hank knew, a big, wet tear appeared in the corner of his eye. Theodore, you hurt my feelings, he said. Well, I didn't mean to, Hank, Theodore said softly. Oh, I'm sorry. Hank turned towards Inverness. Suddenly, he knew why the ship was leaving the harbor. I think, he said slowly, I think I hurt Inverness's feelings. Well, right now I have to try and stop him, said Theodore, and he raced off after Inverness without another word. Hank knew he wasn't allowed to leave the harbor like Theodore. All he could do was wait. Wait and hope Theodore could get Inverness to come back. Hank watched as Theodore talked to Inverness out on the ocean. Slowly, Theodore began to turn back to the harbor. Hank held his breath. A moment later, Inverness started to turn towards the harbor too. When Hank saw that, he floated right out to meet him. Oh, thanks for coming back to our harbor, Hank began. Well, said Inverness in a very quiet voice, I didn't want to, but Theodore promised that no one would call me any more names. Well, I shouldn't have called you that name, said Hank, looking very sad. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. Well, you did, said Inverness. I'm really sorry, said Hank.
Inverness was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My name is Inverness." "And I'm Hank," smiled Hank. "And I think, if you give it a chance, you'll see that this harbor is the friendliest harbor in the whole world." "It really is," said Theodore. Well, as the tugs began to bring Inverness into its dock, they felt so happy they whistled a little tune to everyone. And Inverness joined in too. Because, after all, as everyone knows, the Big Harbor is the friendliest harbor in the whole world. The Big Harbor was in the middle of a big freeze. From the snowdrifts drooping down over the tugboat's dock, all the way up to the long icicles hanging from Benjamin Bridge, everything was cold and frosty and frozen. Now, work never stops in the Big Harbor, even on the most wintry day. And on this particular wintry day, George, Theodore, and Hank had just finished moving a cargo ship out to the ocean. "It sure is cold," shouted Theodore. "Oh, cold doesn't bother tugs like us," grunted George. "We're brave." "We're brave," shouted Hank, and he blew up some smoke just like George.
Hank,
George grinned.
you have a great big icicle hanging from your nose.
Hank grinned and the icicle popped right off. Theodore and George chuckled.
Hank, you always make everyone laugh.
"What's that noise?" said George. A strange, creaky sound was coming from behind Shipwreck Rock. "It sounds," said Hank, "like a giant shark." But George floated forward.
Oh, giant sharks don't bother brave tugs like us.
Then he slowed down a little just in case it was a giant shark. The creaky sound was getting louder and louder. Yes, something was appearing, and it was appearing from around Shipwreck Rock. At first, the tugs could only see the very tip-top of the thing. It was all spiky and white. And then, slowly, it floated out. What is that?" said Theodore, who could hardly speak. "It looks like an ice palace," Hank breathed in amazement. The big white floating thing did look a little like a palace all made of ice, and that ice made it creak as it floated towards the tugs.
Oh, that's probably just a rusty old wreck covered in ice,
snorted George. Now, the tugs could see an anchor, all covered in ice and snow. "It's a ship!" shouted Hank. "If it is a ship," said Theodore, "we should help it into our harbor." The tugs were full of questions for the ice ship as they moved it into the Big Harbor. "How did you get all covered in ice?" asked Theodore. "Where'd you come from?" said Hank.
What's your name?
demanded George. Well, the ice ship didn't answer. It just made its creaky sound as it floated along. "I bet he can't speak because of all the ice," said Theodore. "I wonder who he is under there," Hank whispered.
Probably some useless rust bucket like I said,
snorted George.
Come on, let's get him to the dock.
The next morning, the ice ship was floating exactly where the tugs had left it, tied to its dock. Its ice still made that creaky sound as it rolled a little on the waves. The tugs floated past on their way to work.
Hello, Squeaky,
George called to the ice ship. Well, all the other tugs laughed, except for Theodore. I wouldn't like it if everyone laughed at me, he thought to himself. Theodore floated over to the ship. "Hello," he called. "My name is Theodore. I helped bring you into the harbor, remember?" The ice ship was silent, except for its creak, creak, creak sound. Maybe he can't hear me because of all the ice, Theodore thought. "I was just wondering, what is your name?" It seemed to Theodore that the ice ship creaked just a little bit louder, as if he wanted to tell him something.
Come on, Theodore,
said George.
That old ship is good for nothing, and we have important work to do.
"I have to go now," Theodore said to the ice ship. "But I'll come visit tomorrow if you like." "Okay," smiled Theodore. "I'll see you tomorrow." Theodore didn't know why, But he felt that underneath all that cold ice on the ship was a nice warm engine, and just maybe a friend. The following day, the tugs were all gathered round the dispatcher for the morning work meeting.
Theodore, Hank, said the dispatcher, there is a ship out at the grain dock. He is in the way of the other ships.
Theodore realized right away the dispatcher was talking about the ice ship. Yes, Hank, George, and I took him there, said Theodore. He's covered in ice.
I know, said the dispatcher. I would like you to move him to the junk dock.
But, sir, said Theodore, swallowing the big lump in his throat, the junk dock is for ships who aren't good for anything.
I'm sorry, Theodore, but George tells me that ice ship doesn't move or even speak. We can't have him floating in that dock. There are other ships who need to stay there. Please, move him to the junk dock.
Move him to the junk dock? The dispatcher's words made Theodore suddenly feel as cold as if he was covered in ice. Theodore and Hank went to get the ice ship. We have to move you to another dock, Theodore said to the ship. Unless you don't want us to. All you have to do is tell us where you'd like to go instead. But the ice ship still said nothing. Hank, said Theodore sadly, we better get started. This ship sure is heavy with all that ice, puffed Theodore. If we could get the ice off him, huffed Hank, we could pull it faster. That's a great idea, said Theodore. It is, said Hank. I mean, it is. Theodore, what is my great idea? We'll get the ice off him, said Theodore. Then everyone will see that underneath he's really a great ship. Hank, I know what to do. Theodore and Hank pulled the ice ship to a small cove. It's warm in this little cove, explained Theodore. The sun will melt the ice. All we have to do is wait. Well, the tugs waited and waited and waited. And the ice ship did begin to melt. Drip by drip by drip. Wake up, Hank, tooted Theodore. Did he melt yet? Yawned Hank. Almost, frowned Theodore. One icicle melted. Great, said Hank. Only about a zillion billion more to go. The tugs heard a sharp whistle. It was Pearl, the pilot boat. You're supposed to be taking that ship to the junk dock, said Pearl. You better get going. Well, Theodore and Hank had done their best, but now it really was time to take the ice ship to the junk dock. The two tugs raced into position, but they were so worried about being late, they bumped right into each other. Hank, said Theodore, turn around. Hank turned all right, but in the same direction as Theodore, and once again, they bumped into each other. Hank, shouted Theodore, turn the other way. Theodore and Hank looked around to see if Pearl was watching, but Pearl was staring at something else. The ice ship was shaking and making its creak, creak, creak sound louder and louder. And then a little ice fell from the ship. And that's when Theodore realized something wonderful. He's laughing, shouted Theodore. He's laughing, Hank. You gave me another great idea. I did, said Hank. I did. Theodore, what is my other great idea? All we have to do is make him laugh some more, said Theodore. If he laughs, I bet he'll shake off all that ice. But, said Hank, how do we make him laugh? You can do it, shouted Theodore. You always make everyone laugh. Sure, said Hank. Hank made his silliest face. Theodore and Hank laughed and laughed, and once again, the ice ship creaked even louder this time. Hank decided to do his very funniest thing. He rolled his eyes and went around and around in a circle, tooting his whistle. Theodore went racing right behind him, tooting his whistle and hooting with laughter. Hank was so excited, he bumped right into Theodore again. Hank, frowned Theodore, well, that's not funny. Well, the most incredible thing happened. The ice ship creaked and creaked, shaking more and more ice off himself. A little at first, and then in great big chunks. And as he laughed and laughed, he shook and shook. And you know what? It wasn't long before all the ice was gone. And there, in its place, was a beautiful sea trawler.
Top of the morning to you, tugboats, said the trawler. You sure are funny.
Theodore and Hank, they could only stare at the ship in amazement.
Allow me to introduce myself, said the ship. My name is Seamus, and I'm a sea trawler.
My name is Tugboat, and I'm a Hank, said Hank, who was so surprised to see such a beautiful ship he couldn't even speak properly. How did you get all covered in ice? Asked Theodore. I was fishing way out on the cold North Sea, replied Seamus, when a big storm came along and covered me up stem to stern in ice. Now, if it wasn't for you tugs making me laugh so hard, I'd probably be frozen all winter long. In the junk dock, shivered Hank. And then the tugs remembered. They were supposed to be moving Seamus to the junk dock.
Well, said Seamus, I don't think I'm ready for any junk dock.
He looked like an old good-for-nothing ship with all that ice on him, said Pearl. But underneath, I can see he's really a fine ship. We don't need to take him to the junk dock. There is one place I'd like to take him, said Theodore, and he grinned at Hank. The other tugs were at the great ocean dock when Theodore and Hank came along, pulling Seamus.
What a great sea trawler,
Gasped George.
I wonder where he came from.
Oh, you know him, George, called Theodore.
I do?
Frowned George. Well, you call him Squeaky, but his real name is Seamus, said Theodore. Seamus thought your name was Smoky, Hank said to George. Well, all the tugs had a very good laugh about that. Even George laughed, and he blew up some more smoke.
Well, I thought you were just a rusty wreck,
Smiled George.
What's all that stuff on your deck?
Oh, well, that's my special equipment, Georgie,
replied Seamus. It helps me find my way around when I'm out in the ocean all alone for months at a time.
All alone on the ocean for months?
Gasped George.
You're really brave. Can you tell me some of your ocean stories?
Ah, sure,
said Seamus, with a hearty smile in his voice.
if you show me the way out of the harbor. I've got fishing to do.
Well, you didn't have to ask George twice. George showed Seamus the way out of the big harbor, and all the way those two talked about some of the ocean adventures they'd had. All the tugs were sad to see Seamus leave, but the saddest one of all was George.
Toodaloo, Georgie,
Tooted Seamus.
Goodbye, Seamus,
Whistled George. George watched his new friend leave. What a great ship, he said softly to himself. What a great ship. Dartmouth, the cable ship, was visiting the big harbor. He was laying his giant cable along the shore. Please move me a little closer, Theodore, he called. Theodore helped push the great ship a little closer to shore. Thanks, Theodore, said Dartmouth. I really couldn't do this without you. You're welcome, smiled Theodore. He just loved helping Dartmouth steer in and out of the winding inlets and coves around the big harbor. It was an important job, but most of all, Dartmouth was so nice. Oops, called a voice. Sure enough, it was Digby, the harbor's own small cable ship. He was helping too, kind of.
Barnacles and blisters.
Blubbered Digby.
Stuck on the gibberty-spiggity cable again.
It seems poor Digby is always getting stuck on something. Theodore helped Digby untangle himself. There you go, Digby, smiled Theodore.
Thanks, Theodore,
Said Digby. I think I spend more time helping Digby than Dartmouth, he thought to himself with a grin. It sure is a great day to lay cables, said Dartmouth. The greatest, agreed Theodore.
The finest kind of day,
Chirped Digby. I don't think there was anything those three liked better than laying cables together. And talking about cables together. And, well, just being together. Working with you is my favorite thing in the whole world, Theodore said to Digby and Dartmouth. Why, thank you, Theodore, said Dartmouth with a big smile on his voice. I like working with you both very much, too.
We're the three good buddies,
Proclaimed Digby.
aren't we, boys?
We sure are, agreed Dartmouth. And always will be, concluded Theodore. The three friends were almost at the entrance of the harbor. Well, announced Dartmouth, I'm finished. For the day, added Theodore with a smile.
And what a superior day it was, too,
chimed Digby. No, said Dartmouth. I mean, I'm finished laying my cable here in the big harbor.
Finished, are you?
Said Digby.
Superior. And what's next for us three good buddies, then?
Well, said Dartmouth, actually, now I'll be taking the end of my cable here all the way across the ocean.
Going away, are you, Dartmouth?
Said Digby.
Oh, well, that's nice. Off to new places and so forth. Superior.
Well, can you come back tomorrow? Asked Theodore quietly. Well, no, replied Dartmouth. The next day? Asked Theodore. Well, no, repeated Dartmouth. Well, when can you come back, Dartmouth? Continued Theodore. Theodore, said Dartmouth slowly, I won't be coming back to the big harbor for a long time. Well, it suddenly felt like all the air had leaked out of Theodore's bumpers. Dartmouth was leaving. Theodore was so surprised and upset, he couldn't think of anything to say next. Digby, said Dartmouth, since I won't be here, someone has to look after my cables.
Well, that's only natural,
Said Digby.
I certainly hope you can find someone good.
Would you like to be in charge of my cables when I'm gone? Asked Dartmouth.
Would I?
Shouted Digby right away.
All my starfish and little oysters, would I ever? Should I check cables every day, or some cables one day and others the next? Or maybe half the cables in the morning and half...
Hey, what happened to Theodore? Asked Dartmouth suddenly.
Now, that's funny,
Said Digby.
he didn't even say goodbye.
Theodore floated off by himself. I don't want Dartmouth to leave, he said softly. I don't want to say goodbye. Saying goodbye felt like losing a friend, and that felt awful. The next morning, the other tugs set off for work. The dispatcher asked Theodore to stay behind a moment. Theodore, he said, since Dartmouth is leaving this morning, I thought you might like a special time before work to say goodbye to him. Oh, I don't really want to say goodbye, replied Theodore quietly. Well, I thought you and Dartmouth were good friends, said the dispatcher, who was very surprised. But he's going away, said Theodore. And all my friends live here in the big harbor with me. Theodore's job that morning was moving Barrington Barge. He was floating along when he heard a familiar little croaky sound. Sure enough, it was Digby's horn. Theodore! Theodore! Shouted the little cable ship, all out of breath. Wait up! Wait up! Dartmouth is leaving now, puffed Digby. And I thought we could go and say goodbye together, and then I'm off to check his cables. Imagine me, Digby D cable ship, in charge of all them humongous cables. Oh, superior! I don't want to say goodbye, Digby, replied Theodore quickly. But Theodore, said Digby, puzzled, we're the three good buddies, aren't we? And we have to say goodbye together, don't we? We can't be the three good buddies anymore, replied Theodore softly. Dartmouth won't be here. Oh, said Digby slowly. Well, I'll just say goodbye for you then, shall I, Theodore? And with that, Digby floated off as fast as he could. After Theodore had finished moving Barrington Barge, he started to go home to his dock. Just then, the harbor rumbled with the sound of a deep, powerful blast. It was Dartmouth's whistle.
2 more long blasts followed. With a sudden chill, Theodore knew Dartmouth was saying goodbye to the harbor. Then, suddenly, a different sound echoed through the big harbor. It was Digby's horn. And it sounded like he was in trouble. I bet he's stuck somewhere again, Theodore said to himself, and hurried off in the direction of the sound. Theodore followed Digby's horn to a little cove, and, sure enough, there was the small cable ship.
Oh, Theodore,
Sputtered Digby.
I was officially commencing my first inspection of Dartmouth's cables, and I guess I was kind of excited and so forth, and I wasn't watching where I was attending to. Well, I guess I kind of got stuck on this spliggity-spoggity sandspit.
Don't worry, Digby, called Theodore. I'll pull you out.
Hello, Theodore.
Dartmouth, said Theodore. What are you doing here? I was leaving, explained Dartmouth, when I heard Digby's horn. Oh, said Theodore. And also, I wanted to say goodbye to you, Theodore. Theodore slowly looked up at the big ship. Dartmouth, he began. I really wanted to say goodbye, but I guess I couldn't. I didn't want you to go away. Theodore, said Dartmouth in a very gentle voice, we'll still be friends, no matter how far apart we are. We will, said Theodore. Of course we will, said Dartmouth. You'll just have a friend in a whole new place. Well, said Theodore after a moment, I never thought of it that way. And one day, Dartmouth went on, when you're a bigger tug, maybe you can come across the ocean and visit me. Well, said Theodore, maybe I will.
Can I come too?
Digby was suddenly floating right there beside them. Digby, said Theodore, I thought you were stuck.
Well,
Said Digby with a sly smile in his voice.
I was kind of stuck. We stuck figuring out a way to get us both to say goodbye to Dartmouth, that is.
Well, Theodore just had to smile. Theodore, said Dartmouth, it really is time for me to say goodbye now. Theodore floated very close to Dartmouth. Goodbye, Dartmouth, he said in his bravest voice. I'm really going to miss you. Goodbye, Theodore, said Dartmouth. I'm going to miss you too, very much. It seemed everything in the big harbor stood still for a moment. Then, Dartmouth began to float away. Streaming his giant cable behind him. Wait, called Theodore. Well, how will I know where to find you when I'm bigger? I'll always be at the end of this cable, called Dartmouth. Anytime you want me, all you have to do is give it a tug. And then, with one last great blast of his horn, Dartmouth was gone.
Oops.
It was Digby.
Theodore, I think I really am stuck this time. Oh, God, I wonder how am I ever going to take care of these great big cables?
Don't worry, Digby, smiled Theodore. I'll always be here to help you. Theodore quickly got Digby untangled. And the two set off to check cables together. It sure is a great day to check cables, said Theodore.
Finest kind of day.
Chirped Digby.
Theodore,
Yes, Digby, said Theodore.
we're still the three good buddies, aren't we?
We sure are, smiled Theodore, glancing at Dartmouth's cable.
Superior.
Said Digby.